Hebrews, like many here, it's one of my favorite books of the New Testament because one of the things, it is a masterful teaching that answers any and every objection that the Jews would have had regarding Jesus. And certainly he was as Christ, the Son of God, and as man, as we'll see in this particular chapter. Now, part of the issue here is these Hebrews, these Jews were in severe danger of slipping back into Judaism and slipping back under the old Mosaic law. And certainly that obviously would have been a huge mistake, as everything in the old law pointed to Jesus and Jesus as its fulfillment. And you know, well, a lot of times people will say, well, y'all don't believe in the Old Testament. Yes, we absolutely believe in the Old Testament. The Old Testament tells us about Jesus, who he was going to be, how he was going to come in this world, how he was going to save mankind, how he intercedes for us. It gives us all of that kind of background. But we understand that when Jesus came and died on the cross, he fulfilled the old law and a new covenant of which we are under. But they were in fear of reverting back to Judaism. And that, of course, would nullify the very salvation that the law promised. So, chapter 2 begins with a very strong warning where he says, we must pay more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. Now, this looks back to Hebrews, the first chapter, verses 1 and 2. I'm going to have to look here. Yes, where he says, in the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things and through whom he made the universe. We must pay careful attention, more careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard. Well, what did you hear? You heard the gospel from Jesus. Now, we'll get into this in a few minutes as he gets further into this chapter. But you heard it through Jesus. You heard it from the people that walked and talked with Jesus. You heard it from others. And this was all confirmed. Again, we'll get into that later. But he said, don't drift away. Now, the idea of drifting away is one in which as we see in Acts, the 27th chapter there, you know, you remember that the Apostle Paul, they were on the ship and they were going around Cyprus, and the storm was contrary and everything, and they couldn't get to port. And kind of that's the idea that we're talking about here, that it's like a boat drifting away to a contrary wind. You know, that's one thing about this life, is there's winds that are contrary to us on a regular basis. There's things that's always pushing against us. Satan is always out there ready to deliver trials. There's always that pushes against us. And if you're not diligent, just like a ship against a contrary wind, you will drift. You won't make it to port. And he says, we must pay more careful attention to those things that were said so that we will not drift. You know, Ephesians 4th chapter and 14th verse says, then we will no longer be like infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful schemes. We don't want to be tossed back and forth by the waves. We don't want to be pushed around. We want to be firm. But if we're not diligent, we will drift. And that's what these Jewish Hebrews were in danger of. So he begins this with a very strong warning against that. And then he moves on into Hebrews, the second chapter, in the second verse, where he says, for if the message spoken by angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, How shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? Now, you'll notice I've stopped there in the middle of verse 3 because we'll pick it up in the next piece, but we want to contain this thought right here. He says, if the message spoken by angels was binding. Now, this can be a little bit confusing because wait, what is he talking about? What message was binding? He's talking about the old law. And we look at that and we say, well, wait a second. God spoke directly to Moses and gave that to him. Well, let's see what the Bible says about that. In Galatians, the 3rd chapter, in verse 19, it says, what then was the purpose of the law? It was added because of transgressions until the seed to whom the promise referred had come. The law was put into effect through angels by a mediator. Acts 7:35. You remember, this is where Stephen is giving his testimony before the Sanhedrin. And he says, this is the same Moses whom they rejected with the words, who made you ruler and judge. He was sent to be the ruler and deliverer by God himself through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. And in verse 53, he says, you have received the law that was put into effect through angels, but have not obeyed it. So he's establishing here that the law was put into effect through angels. And yet, he's already established in chapter 1 that angels are inferior to Jesus. So you see what the writer is doing here. He's established that angels are below the Son. And the law was put into effect through angels. But the gospel was put into effect through Jesus. The superior delivers a superior message. The inferior delivers an inferior message. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that there was something wrong with the law. It was that it was inferior to the gospel. The law could not save. And so, having established that, he then says that the message spoken by angels was binding. And they understood this. And every violation and disobedience, let me back up here so we can see this. Every violation and disobedience received its just punishment. Now, under the old law, and this violation, you might see transgressions and disobedience there. So you might see transgressions and disobedience there. Violation or transgression is a breaking of a law. It's a crossing over of a negative command. And so there's just a subtle difference here between these two, but it's enough. Okay, so you have a crossing over of a negative command where disobedience is a refusal to obey a positive command. Okay? In other words, the law says don't do this and you go do it anyway. Okay, that's a transgression. You've crossed over the law. The law says go do this and you go, no, I'm not going to do that. Okay, so that's the idea. And he says there that even under the old law that was delivered by angels, that every violation or transgression and disobedience received its just punishment. That idea of punishment there is recompense or a reward for work done. Okay? You sin, you pay the punishment, that's your reward for your work done. You get, and it's just. It was just under the old law, and it would be just currently under the new law. But it was a just recompense for work done. And so if there's no escape, now notice he says there, how shall we escape if we ignore or neglect, as some translations say, such a great salvation? If an inferior law delivered by inferior angels. I'll keep using that, but understand what I'm saying here. If there was no escape under this, how in the world do you think you're going to escape under a superior law delivered by a superior being? Obviously, that is a rhetorical question, because the answer is obviously you won't. And so he's trying to make these Jews understand that going back to the old law, you understand what that means, but you're neglecting, you are ignoring a great salvation. So, moving on, this salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Now, you know, they would look at the Old Testament and they would look at the various miracles that have happened and everything, and they would say, well, this was confirmed by God. Well, his answer to that is that this salvation, delivered by Jesus himself, it was first announced by the Lord. And then he says it was confirmed, made sure to us by those who heard him directly. They heard him. The apostles heard his teaching. They were taught on a regular basis, and they then gave that. And so you look at that and you're going, this was delivered by the Son of God himself. You want confirmation of what the truth is, what this salvation is all about? Jesus himself preached that salvation. His apostles and those who heard him preached that salvation. And then he goes on to say, God also himself testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles. Well, you can't ignore that. But he's not through. And gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. He said, you've experienced this. You've seen this. You can't ignore this salvation that was preached by the Lord himself. Now, the next section that we get into, it seems to me to be an answer to a Jewish objection that the Christ, the Son of God, deity himself, would be found in the form of a mortal man. Now, I don't know that that's exactly the case, but that's what it appears to me. And according to chapter 1 and verse 14, angels are just ministering spirits to those who are to inherit salvation. So that's what angels are. So therefore, he said, it is not to angels that he subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. But there is a place where someone has testified. Now, I like what R.C.H. Linsky says here, so I kind of quoted from him, and I give him credit and everything. I like what he says concerning this. He says, angels are not joint heirs with the supreme heir. Angels are not to sit on the throne with this heir and to reign with him in the new heaven and earth. Not with angels did the Son become associated, but only with the seed of Abraham by assuming not the nature of angels, but the human nature of Abraham's seed. He said it's not, angels aren't going to sit on his throne. Angels aren't joint heirs with him. We'll get into that in a few moments. They're not joint heirs with him. They're not going to, in the world to come, the world's not going to be subjected to them. But man, God became man in the form of Jesus because man was going to be honored with him. And that is a huge point because it is important for us to understand, as it is with them, it is very difficult to grasp the idea of God coming down and being in the form of man. In fact, I'll just be dead honest. It's just, I can't wrap my head around it. But it was the only way for us to be joint heirs with him. It was the only way for us to rule with him in the world to come. It was the only way, as he will get into, for us to be brothers with him. So, so it's not the angels that the world was subjected. He says, but there is a place where someone has testified. So the writer then quotes from Psalms, the 8th chapter. And he says there, but there is a place where someone has testified. What is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor and put everything under his feet. Now, the writer, David, in Psalms and here, present us with about three kind of paradoxical statements, okay? And so it's in order to kind of grasp what is being said here, we have to understand that he says, when is man that you are mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? To care for in the Greek means to look after or show concern for. Some will say even visit. And so in our earthly eyes, mankind is lower than the angels, okay? We look at the angels, the power that they're around the throne of God, and we see them, and we are lower in our own minds, okay? And rightfully so, while we're here on earth. And yet, okay, the first paradox is laid out for us. We, as mankind, don't have the power of angels. We don't sit around the throne room of God himself. And yet it wasn't angels that he minded. It wasn't the Son, it wasn't angels that he crowned with glory and honor and put everything under his feet. It's man. Now, if we go back to Psalms, the 8th chapter, verses 3 through 8, we're going to kind of read the entire thing there so that we can kind of get more of a sense of the context of what is being said there. So in Psalms, the 3rd chapter, 8th chapter, 3rd verse, he says, when I consider your heavens, think about that. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, first paradox, what is man that you're mindful of him? And we feel that way. We understand that. When we look at the universe, when we look at everything that is out there, when we see all the great and awesome and mighty works of God, who are we that God would care for us? And yet, he says he crowned us with honor and glory. He says, you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have made him ruler over the works of your hands. You put everything under his feet, all flocks and herds and beasts of the fields, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and all that swim the paths of the seas. Now, we know from Genesis, the 1st chapter and 26th verse, that was the intent. God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock and over all the earth and over all the creatures that move along the ground. Over everything. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase and fill the earth. Rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves on the ground. And that's what Psalms, the 8th chapter, was talking about. But we know what happened. We know what happened in Genesis, the 3rd chapter. Man fell. We'll get into that in a moment. So the third paradox, he says, in putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him. God said everything is subject to man. But we look around and we go, no, it's not. No. There's so much is out of our control. We are not fulfilling that. And we don't fulfill it because of why? Sin. Sin entered the world. And with it, everything that came along. In Genesis, the 3rd chapter, as we talked about, man sinned. And so God said to Adam, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree which I commanded you, you must not eat. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat of the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. For dust you are, and dust you will return. That's what's happened. Sin entered the world. The grand scheme was uprooted. And so the third paradox here that we're dealing with is the fact that man was supposed to be over everything, but he's not. And so there we get to the next verse that begins with a very big little word. But. Man was supposed to have rule. Man was supposed to have dominance over everything. Man was supposed to be that way. We do not see that. The writer says, you look around, we don't see that. Nothing is subject to him the way it was supposed to be. But we do see Jesus. But we do see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Jesus fulfilled that. He has everything subject under him. He is crowned with honor and glory. Jesus was fulfilled what Psalms 8 was talking about. This is the first time in the book that we actually see the name of Jesus used. It's referred to the Son, referred to the Lord, referred to various ways, but he says Jesus. He is crowned. Why? He's crowned with glory and honor. Why? Because he suffered death. You know, some will say, well, I'm saved by grace. If you're saved at all, it is by grace. For God's grace was that Jesus might taste death for everyone. Now, this is another important point. I don't want to get off on it and everything. But, you know, in Calvinism, they always talk about limited atonement. Jesus only died for those who were supposed to be saved. That's not what this says. He might taste death for everyone. Verse 10, in bringing many sons to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. So, obviously, in bringing salvation to man, he says it was fitting, and that means proper, it was suitable. Now, I'll get to this point in a minute, that he should make him the author, and that word is simply founder or leader. Some will say captain, and it really doesn't make any difference. He is the founder of this. He should make him the founder of the salvation, perfect through suffering. God is sovereign. People will ask, well, why does it have to be that way? You know, God chose it. God is sovereign. And it's the point he is making here. God, for whom and through whom everything exists. You know, that's another thing that people will say, well, why is the universe this way? Why is it like this? Well, it wasn't made for you. It was made for him and through him. And in the same way, we can't question why God chose to do it this way, because he's sovereign. He's the one that has been, that we've turned from. He's the one that we've sinned against. And as sovereign maker, he's the one that gets to choose how it's going to be. And he thought it was fitting or suitable that many sons be brought to glory by the death of the author. Now, I have some difficulty with this passage, and I'll tell you why. I can grasp the idea of substitutionary death. We've sinned. We deserve to die. Christ died in our place. What I have difficulty grasping, even though I'm going to attempt it here in a moment, what I have difficulty grasping is the idea that Jesus had to be made complete through suffering. You know, it's one thing to die sinless. It's another thing for him to suffer the most agonizing and awful things that he did while on this earth, and certainly on his way to Calvary and on the cross. It is, I don't understand totally why that's the case, that he had to suffer. Now, we're going to get into it in a minute, but he was made complete, it says, through that suffering. Now, maybe it is, when I think of that, okay, this is my thoughts on it. I think of the fact that Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he asked that the cup be taken from him. But ultimately he said, not my will, but yours. During his arrest, he said, I could call 12 legions of angels. But he didn't. You think he was tempted? Do you think he was tempted when he said, please, Father, take this cup from me? Yes. Drops of sweat, like great drops of blood, fell to the ground. He was in agony over what he was about to face. But he said, not my will, but thine. When he was mocked by the priest, and they said, let him come down from the cross and we'll believe him. He could have. But he didn't. He was made complete through that suffering. And did it have to be that way? I don't, obviously it did, because that's what he says here. But it's hard. Verses 11 and 12, but the one who makes men holy, and those who are made holy, so we have Jesus who makes men holy, and us who are made holy as a result of it, are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the presence of the congregation, I will sing your praises. He became flesh so that he could save us. And in doing so, he became brothers with us. Now that is a concept that is very hard to grasp. That you are brothers and sisters to the Son of God. He is heir to all things according to Hebrews 1 and 2. And we inherit salvation. And therefore we are joint heirs with him according to Romans 8:17, where it says we're joint heirs. Therefore it is plain that we must be brothers of the same family. Angels are not part of that brotherhood. All right, Jews, get that through your head. Angels aren't part of that brotherhood. He came down to be like us, and he had to come down to be like us in order to be able to do what he does next. Now, He quotes from the Psalms, the 22nd chapter and 22nd verse there, when he says, I will declare your name to my brothers. In the presence of the congregation, I will sing your praises. Now, word congregation there is the term ecclesia, which is congregation or an assembly, okay? And it's what the New Testament terms church. But he says there, he quotes from the 22nd chapter of Psalms. And we're all familiar with the 22nd chapter. We are. You may not think so. Okay. You think, wait, what chapter is that now? Flip over there real quick. What's the 22nd chapter? From mirth I was cast upon you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, for there's no one to help. Many bulls surround me, and strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions tearing their prey open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted away within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. We read that all the time. Well, that's where that's from. And he says there that I will declare my name to your brothers. And I will sing as one of us. We sing praises to God all the time. He, along with us, does as well. So, in Hebrews 2:13, he says, and again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here am I, the children of God, children God has given me. And that's from Isaiah, the 8th chapter, verses 17 and 18. So although he himself was God, in his human nature here on earth, Jesus depended on God in complete trust. Think of all the prayers that he prayed. On the cross, he commended his human spirit into his Father's hands. In all this, he was like all God's sons, living and dying in trust in God. What we're supposed to do is live in trust in God and to die in trust in God. So he says, I will put my trust in him. He did. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. Now, he says he destroyed him who holds the power of death. Now, we think of destroy, we think of annihilation, but that term there is one of taking the power away from. So he continues to pursue this idea of fellowship with Christ with those who are being saved. And this is such an important point for these Jewish Christians. Any objection to the Christ being deity and the need to be human is not only overcome, but should be embraced as brothers and fellow heirs with him. Philippians, who being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance of a man. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. So what we have here is paradoxically death destroyed death. Let's skip forward here. The last two verses, he said, for this reason he had to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. The climax of this chapter is right here. And it introduces a new point that's going to be expanded upon in later chapters with this high priesthood. He is merciful, having been made like us in every part of our human nature. but yet ultimately faithful to God and never having committed any sin. He atones for the sins of us by his own blood, which again, that will be expanded upon in later chapters. But it is by his suffering here on earth that he is able to be that merciful high priest. Not just merciful, a faithful one. You know, the high priest of old, they might have been merciful to some degree because they were human and everything, but they could not be totally faithful. And so when they went in, they offered sacrifices for their own sins as well. Again, I'm jumping ahead. But these Jewish Christians were undergoing and had undergone sufferings. And they were in danger of slipping away. And he says to them, because Jesus suffered, he can be that merciful high priest. Because you have been tempted, he understands. And he is able to help those who are being tempted. In Hebrews, the 10th chapter and 32nd verse, he says, remember those early days, talking to these Jews. Remember those early days after you had received the light, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. Verses 33 describes insults, imprisonment, persecution, confiscation of property that these Jews had endured. How could they object to a suffering Messiah who understands and comes to the aid of their suffering? Because he suffered as well, and even to a greater degree. That closes this chapter, and we'll open it up for any questions or comments.
I thought you did a wonderful job. I'm not going to say much, or I won't have anything to say next week on the next chapter. You did a really good job. I appreciate the introduction. You just set up wonderful for next week.
Okay, thank you.
You know, your passage in Hebrew, the second chapter and verse 3, makes a very solid point as far as communication with it in the Pentecostal persuasion, you know, of why did Jesus perform miracles? And that is a big issue in debates and one thing after another. I remember numerous situations where that issue would approach. Hebrew 2 and verse 3 gives us one of three reasons why. Now there may be more, but at least three that I'm thinking of right now. But Hebrew 2 and verse 3 shows us that miracles were done to confirm the word. Using your verse, this salvation was first announced, and it went by my mind. Okay, there it is. Was confirmed to us by them that heard him. God also testified, as you pointed out so adequately, and God also testified by signs and wonders and various miracles. So miracles were done for three reasons. Number one, not necessarily in this order, but the order I'm going to give, to confirm the word. That's your passage, Hebrew 2 and 3. Also to make believers. You remember the conversion of Nicodemus in John 3. He said, no man can do the miracles that you do unless God be with him. And Nicodemus was converted. And that was a conversion rate to make believers is why. And the third reason is to prove that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. In John, the 20th chapter, verse 30 and 31, in the New King James Version, it said, these things are written, talks about his miracles, these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. So what you started off with just kind of exploded in my head in a positive way about the purpose of these miracles were coming to pass here, and it's showing that Jesus is superior to all others, and to make believers, to confirm his word, to prove he is the Son of God. A very powerful passage that really goes a long way. You did a total wonderful job, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I was edified by it.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Anything else?
No, sir.
You got the floor.
Yeah.
Anybody on this side? If not, you've been a wonderful audience, and I appreciate the attention that you've shown. We never want to close the service without extending the invitation that you can come believing, repenting, confessing, and being baptized for the remission of your sins. And if you need the prayers of the church for any reason, if you strayed away, or if there's any reason, we urge you to come while we stand and sing.